Okay, we are back. I'm very happy to have on the Goldstein on Gelt Show Professor Dirk Philipsen, who has recently come out with a new book called The Little Big Number, How GDP Came to Rule the World and What to Do About It. Dirk, a real pleasure to have you.
Great to be here.
So the title of your book has so many implications, but let's just start with some real basics. My understanding has always been that the term GDP simply represents the total dollar value of all the goods and services produced, let's say, in a year. And you look at that so you can compare this year's GDP to last year's GDP. Do I have the right definition before we even get into what this is really all about?
That is essentially correct definition, yes.
All right. So how did GDP come to rule the world?
So this is a really rather broad and big and complicated, but just remarkable story, I think. So what I am trying to show in the book is that GDP has not always been around, that it is actually a rather recent vintage. And that initially it was not the blueprint of the GDP really was developed in the United States and to some extent in England by people like Simon Kuznets and Colin Clark as a response to what at the time was still the largest ever economic crisis in history, which is the Great Depression. And what people oftentimes no longer realize is that at the time of at the depth of the Great Depression, policymakers and economists both had very little understanding as to what was actually going on and had very insufficient data on things like number of unemployed or investments or income or wealth or productive capacities or any of those things. And so it was really in response to a few politicians in the Senate in the U.S. primarily who, were desperately trying to figure out what a political response could look like to this depression that was lasting and getting worse rather than better and literally threatening to bring down the entire society.
So just to understand, you're saying that the concept of GDP was a political construct and didn't really exist before the Great Depression?
That is correct. So what these economists essentially did is they sent out surveys and they looked at census data and they basically tried to give they shed some light into the darkness that existed prior to their work on what was going on in the national economy. And so they provided essential data that policymakers then used in order to come up with things like the New Deal. Essentially also data that was absolutely essential for Keynesianism to really take off. Without the data, the governmental impact would not have been possible.
Mm-hmm. So when we look at GDP, or when you're saying that the economists were developing it around that time, of course the country was suffering. It seems, or at least my understanding is that people look at GDP as a way to understand the prosperity of a nation, meaning if they have more gross domestic product, then they have more stuff going on. They got more health care and they have more freedom and they got more stuff they can buy. Is that true or not true?
Well, yes and no. So this is where the story gets interesting, and that's also where I think the story ultimately gets somewhat troubling and pressing for us today. So it is true that GDP is a reasonably good measure for economic output. But it is important to realize that it is just simply and merely and exclusively a measure of output of goods and services. So what that means is that it doesn't tell you anything about quality. It doesn't tell you anything about real prosperity. It doesn't tell you anything about things like purpose or direction of activities. So, another way to put this, it is the creation of a logic that is by now literally universal. In fact, as an historian, I cannot think of a single logic that is as universal as GDP. Virtually every major economy in the world measures its output its prosperity by that measure. Mm-hmm. And as a measure of output, it essentially, another way to put this would be to say that the more we turn life into commodities, like trees into lumber, fossils into fuels, atmosphere into, carbon dumps, lakes into resorts, land into parking lots, human skills into wage labor, or education into investments, and I could go on, the better. And why is that a problem today? Of course, is because as a measure, it is ultimately what I would call accounting without accountability, right? It measures the good as much as the bad or the hazardous. And in fact, as a measure, things like oil spills or accidents or addictions are among the most favorable events as measured by GDP because they require a lot of goods and services that make this thing go up.
I see. We are talking with Dirk Philipsen, who recently came out with a new book called The Little Big Number, How GDP Came to Rule the World and What to Do About It. He's been describing to us a little bit in the first half of the interview about really what GDP is. Dirk, I just have a question. I understand, my day job as a financial advisor, I have to understand a lot of different numbers. And I appreciate the fact that when people analyze a stock, it's not just looking at the price of the stock. You want to look at the price-earnings ratio and the debt, and there's
right.
a dozen numbers that someone who's in the business is gonna look at in terms of these ratios. It seems to me that GDP is just one of the numbers that we look at, because certainly in the news they always talk about unemployment figures and they'll talk about growth in certain sectors. So the way I can't even imagine that there's one number that everyone looks at and says, this is the bottom line. GDP really does seem to me just a figure that can tell us exactly the information that we defined earlier, the total dollar value of the goods and services produced. And the title of your book suggests we should do something about that. What's really the problem with that we should do something about?
So this would require more time than we have, but
sorry, maybe it was too long of a question.
In essence, what I am saying is that the way we define income, investments, wealth, and such are essentially all a function of how we measure GDP, and GDP no longer is just a measure or an indicator. It has moved from a descriptive tool to a prescriptive target, and has essentially become the goal of national and international economies.
So you're saying a politician could say that he grew the GDP at 3%, but this could have been because there were, as you described, huge number of oil spills, which is
Correct.
Not good for anyone, but it did create jobs and move money around, and so it looks good on the surface.
Correct.
I see.
And so in essence, what this means that what I'm saying, number one, is that whether you know it or not, and whether you would ultimately, once you look at it more closely, agree with the consequences or not, GDP greatly impacts your life, my life, everybody's life. And in fact, it is essentially the very definition of what we mean when we talk about an economy today. So whether your job is considered to be successful is ultimately, in the final analysis, a function of whether you're contributing to the GDP regime. And the same is true with businesses and corporations, and of course also with the way we gauge the success of national governments, for instance.
So let's say we wanted to gauge national governments. Is there a Philipsen figure that we could use that would be a better tool to say, listen, so-and-so became president, and 4 years later, X, there's something we can truly measure to see if he was successful, or she, as the case may be soon.
So two quick answers to that. One is that what one can learn from my book is that the way the GDP was put together and continues to be put together is not some kind of objective figure, but rather is a consequence of lots of compromise and very subjective decisions as to what to count and what not to count. And in fact, Simon Kuznets, as sort of the father of these accounts, fundamentally disagreed with the way it came to be used in the end. And two, what that means is then when we look at these debates that often happen and people begin to raise critical voices on GDP as a welfare measure, for instance, or even as an economic measure, the response oftentimes is, yeah, but then what are we going to use? What is the alternative? Aren't they all very complicated and subjective? And my answer to that is, well, maybe, but they are no more subjective than GDP. And what we really need is a preferably democratic conversation on where we as a people want to go and how we would define prosperity and how we would define well-being and what elements are part of it and therefore need to be measured. And so there are excellent alternative measures that do a very good job at this, that though still, far from perfect, I would gladly support and embrace as an alternative to GDP tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, like the genuine progress indicator, for instance, that was developed in the U.S.
All right, that is something we're going to have to look at in the next talk. The interesting thing I'm telling you, that I'm finding what you're telling, is I've often suspected that a lot of these numbers are very political. You're pointing out how the GDP is a political number, but things like inflation and all the numbers we get from the government, you kind of have to wonder what goes into them. And I know that people can learn a lot by reading your book. Dirk, we're just about out of time, but in the last few seconds, tell us, how can people learn more about the research you're doing, follow you, and get a copy of your newest book?
Well, my book is available at Princeton University Press and Amazon and places like that, of course. And you can also visit my website, dirkphilipsen.com, where I try to post sort of some of the relevant stories around this issue.
Okay, we will put a link to that, to both of those at the show notes of today's show at goldsteinongelt.com. Dirk Philipsen, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
You are listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Doug's weekly radio show is heard around the world, but if you miss it, you can download the podcast at www.goldsteinongelt.com. The Goldstein on Gelt Show gives you up-to-date financial ideas so you can get on the path to financial freedom. If you'd like your questions answered on the air or off, send Doug an email to doug@profile-financial.com. It's your money for your future, so join Doug every week to build your wealth on the Goldstein on Gelt Show.